I'm reading this outside, so I don't know how the recording will come through, but hopefully it's not terrible. The New Antisemitism by Jean Amery, published in 1976. Is anti-Semitism becoming socially acceptable again? Only 5 years ago, this question would have seemed pretty absurd, and had Jews raised it, it would have been considered an expression of mild paranoia. It seems to me that this has changed dramatically since then. Anti-Semitism rendered impossible to man and the world by something for which, in this discussion, I will use the shorthand Auschwitz, is in the process of inserting itself into political debates again and shamelessly gaining ground. I do not mean the sort of anti-Semitism that has long been integral to the sociability of German and non-German Philistine, who has always considered the, quote, otherness, end quote, of the Jew to be in the guise of a figure like Benjamin Disraeli or that of someone like Rathenau. Repugnant, indeed diabolical. In the eyes of both the little guy and his grand influential counterpart, the Jewish people, branded as deicides, a bizarre notion that Christianity has disseminated with fanatical zeal on some occasions and in a dignified theological guise on others, always had been and continued to be an uncanny ethnic group, a religious community one could not trust. The anti-Semitism of the Philistines has consistently been part of the magical worldview of peoples whom the Enlightenment passed by or who consciously suppressed it. It was not only the, quote, socialism, end quote, of fools. Anti-Semitism was also their metaphysics and social philosophy. The infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion was only the most obvious and crude illustration of a collective mindset that in the course of history has become so deep-seated that even Marx could not escape it, and Otto Weininger, as the paradigmatic self-hating Jew, followed it through to its ultimate logical consequence and did away with himself. This, then, is not the anti-Semitism that concerns me here, or should it, too, need to be discussed? After all, we will see. There's a footnote on Otto Weininger. Shortly after the publication of Sex and Character, in which he combined a plethora of anti-Semitic and misogynistic notions with an oddly perceptive critique of the projective nature of anti-Semitism and misogyny, the Viennese writer Otto Weininger rented a room in the house in which Beethoven had died and there shot himself. Yo, these flies are out of control, dude. End of footnote. This then is not the anti-Semitism that concerns me here, or should it be at all? We will see. What is clear is that quote, classical, end quote, anti-Semitism was there first, although it was implemented nowhere else in as bestial a manner as it was by the German Third Reich. It is a global phenomenon. In this context, I want to point in passing to Sartre's Anti-Semitism and Jew, published in 1946. To my mind, still the last word on the analysis of this particular problem, which constitutes an even greater, quote, stain on the honor, end quote, of civilized humanity than colonialism and imperialism. The anti-Semitism we are confronted with today does not speak its name. On the contrary, if one tries to hold it to account, it disowns itself. It is no easy task to drag it before the court that has long since condemned it, but would nevertheless need to be in constant session. How does the new anti-Semite present himself? His contention is extremely straightforward and prima facie, perfectly plausible. All claims to the contrary notwithstanding, he is no anti-Semite. He is, in fact, an anti-Zionist. With this, he assumes... Wait, hold on. Okay. Yeah, it just says prima facie is a translation of on the face of it, which I think most people know. Where the hell am I? With this, he assumes he has salvaged his honor, all the more so because more than 3 decades have passed since Auschwitz gained its global notoriety. Consequently, the widespread moral outrage it precipitated has now lost its elan vital, which means life force. Even more importantly, the troubles in the Middle East have given rise to terrifying simplistic notions. Today's unabashedly bashful anti-Semite is in luck. The existence of the state of Israel, whose right to exist may be no more legitimate than that of any other state, but neither is it any less well-founded than that of its counterparts in the Christian and non-Christian world, provides him with convenient arguments. Have the Jews in Palestine not expelled a people, the Arab Palestinians, from its ancestral land? More importantly yet, are they not in the Palestinian territories which they have acquired by military means, a brutal occupying power comparable to the Nazis who took control of most of Europe between 1940 and 1945? Are the Israelis not an outpost of global imperialism? Is their notion of statehood and nationhood not destined to lead to ever new wars of conquest? Is the struggle against Israel not part and parcel of the laudable progressive cause, as were the national liberation struggles of the Algerians or the Indonesian peoples? And is one not justified in being apprehensive about the Jews in general, given that avowedly or not, they will ultimately always side with the tyrannical state of Israel? One can call out, quote, "Strike the Zionists dead, make the Near East red," end quote, and while doing so conceal, indeed indignantly reject the insinuation that a further battle cry reverberates within this one, the Nazis' unambiguous, quote, "Perish, Judah," end quote. It is never easy to argue a case when the other party, rather than a genuine willingness to enter into a debate, merely displays noxious bad faith. There would, to be sure, be plenty to discuss. Take, for example, the fact that there is not one, I choose my words carefully, not a single state on earth at whose inception legitimacy and illegitimacy, justice and injustice did not become inextricably entwined. One might point to the fact that, in its role as an occupying power, Israel is surely quite humane, even when it comes to violent measures and possible acts of cruelty that may have been committed. As a fundamental historical evil, such incidents stain the record of every state that has ever had to administer hostile territory. Anyone who does not understand this should be forced to study the history of the German occupation in Holland, Norway, France, Denmark, and so on, or the French occupation of the Ruhr between 1923 and 1925. Yet, would this compulsory study of history make the spurious slogans, the misguided analogies, and the ridiculous prejudices disappear? I rather doubt it. I doubt it, and this brings me back to my main line of argument. Because anti-Zionism is nothing other than an updated version of the age-old and evidently ineradicable, utterly irrational hatred that has been directed against the Jews since time immemorial. In his remarkable book, Outsiders, the German philologist and social philosopher Hans Mayer wrote that, quote, "Whoever attacks Zionism, but by no means wishes to say anything against the Jews, is fooling himself or others," end quote. One should add that the, quote, "fooling oneself," end quote, of the anti-Zionists, who are invariably anti-Semites too, draws on historical, or one might say, collective psychological presuppositions that are not amenable to reasoned debate. The anti-Semite both wants to see radical evil in the Jew and is compelled by these presuppositions to do so. In this context, a usurer serving a princely ruler is less suitable as an object of hatred than an Israeli general. For the anti-Semite, the Jew must always be gotten rid of, no matter what he actually does. Compelled to be a merchant, he is considered a bloodsucker. If he is an intellectual, he supposedly subverts the existing world order with diabolical intent. As a soldier, he is a colonialist. As a soldier, a cruel oppressor. If he is willing to assimilate into his respective host society, the anti-Semite considers him a dishonorable interloper. If the Jew, too, lays claim to that fashionable and much celebrated phenomenon, a, quote, national identity, end quote, one calls him a racist. These are, alas, issues that have been well known for decades. Smart people from Masaryk to Sartre have analyzed them with ample clarity. New at best is the shameful fact that the anti-Semitism claiming to be mere anti-Zionism has its most unrestrained proponents in the political camp one would least suspect of anti-Semitic sentiments, on the political left. Not that the political right has ceased to be anti-Semitic. It falls under the category I previously referred to as the, quote, Philistines, end quote. As ever, those on the right are willing to offer the Jews cautious toleration at best and likely to engage in crude anti-Semitic violence at worst. However, with the exception of the card-carrying old Nazis, they do not, yet, end parenthesis, dare step forward with sufficient forthrightness to allow their stance to be pinned down. They seem to be pussyfooting around yesterday's hot but currently no more than lukewarm topic, confident that their hour will eventually come. Will their hour come? Has it possibly arrived already? Such questions can be answered only with the greatest caution. Prophecies are obviously off limits, but it is certainly legitimate to express one's concerns. Let us begin with the unquestionable fact that leftists are now the most eloquent proponents of anti-Zionism in all its brutishness. This begins with the German Social Democrats youth organization, which is vigorously pushing the older comrades in the party to issue anti-Zionist statements and extend all the way to the Orthodox Soviet communists, Maoists, Trotskyites, and various sectarian groups of independent radical leftists. How the Soviets treat their Jewish citizens is well known the world over. Like the Nazis before them, they imagine that each and every Jew is embroiled in a Zionist imperialist world conspiracy. The New Left, operating outside of the Soviet sphere of influence, insofar as it is genuinely independent of the Soviets, of which I am not entirely convinced, shares the Soviet perception, though it does articulate it in a terminologically more refined manner, which is, however, no less radical for it. One should bear in mind that European terrorists are frequently trained in the use of Soviet weapons in Palestinian settlements, euphemistically called, quote, refugee camps, end quote. And that since anti-Zionist kidnappers regularly find refuge in Soviet-aligned Arab countries when their work is done. And the anti-Zionist kidnappers regularly find refuge in Soviet-aligned Arab countries when their work is done. Footnote. In the early 1970s, members of the German Red Army faction went to Jordan, where they trained with guerrilla fighters from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. End footnote. They are united in refusing time and again to profess their anti-Semitism, and I am perfectly willing to concede that they are not consciously motivated by anti-Semitic resentment, or to be more precise, that they do not recognize their anti-Semitic sentiments as such. Yet their conviction that they are anti-Zionists motivated by injustices perpetrated to their mind on the Palestinians and not in any conventional sense anti-Semites evidently does not run all that deep. For even a modicum of intellectual probity intellectual probity would suffice to let them appreciate that each and every Jew feels a kind of existential bond with the state of Israel and its sovereign existence, regardless of whether he belongs to the Mosaic religious community or not, regardless of whether he supports or rejects Zionism. There are two reasons for this, neither of which has anything to do with metaphysics, a neurotic sense of election or racism. The state of Israel is a commonwealth that has taught the Jews not to allow their self-perception to be impressed on them by the anti-Semites. It is the country where the Jew is not a usurer but a farmer, not a pale stay-at-home but a soldier, not a wholesale merchant but a craftsman. Thanks to the state of Israel, the Jews in the Soviet Union and the United States and France and wherever else the winds of the diaspora may have taken them, have grasped they are human beings like all others. No more and no less. The second, no less clearly defined reason for the Jews' attachment to the tiny state in the Middle East is this. For 2 millennia, they were endangered and dependent on the non-Jews' gaze. Occasionally, they benefited from the non-Jews' good faith. More often, they were at the receiving end of their pronounced ill will. Like dark thunderclouds, the threat of expulsion, of a humiliating death, which they stood no chance of resisting, loomed over them. And in the Third Reich, one of those thunderclouds eventually wreaked the most gruesome catastrophe on the Jews. Since the state of Israel exists, the Jews have a virtual asylum to fall back on, no matter what. I emphasize the term virtual. After all, history does not simply repeat itself like a film on an endless loop, and the rise of another Hitler is unlikely in the extreme. Jews in the United States, for instance, to the intense frustration of radical Zionists and the Israeli government, show no serious intention of swapping the land of milk and honey for the arid, dusty, and stony land of Israel. France's Jews are French Jews in the way Germany's Jews were once German Jews. If only they were granted the full rights of Soviet citizens, even the Soviet Jews wanted to emigrate to the entirely alien state of Israel would be few and far between. What is important to all of them is the option, the existence of a potential asylum. Anyone who has ever lost his home and roamed the earth in search of refuge will understand this. It is unreasonable to expect the young leftists, who are generally well versed in sociology and psychology, should be particularly well placed to empathize with the situation of a group of human beings who have been humiliated for 2 millennia. Let me repeat that. Is it unreasonable to expect that young leftists who are generally well versed in sociology and psychology should be particularly well placed to empathize with the situation of a group of human beings who have been humiliated for 2 millennia? Given that most of them have benefited from higher education and acquired some knowledge of history, should not they, of all people, be able to comprehend that the Palestinian question merely requires a technical solution? The Jewish state, by contrast, buffeted as it is by so much hatred, would, should it founder, bequeath to its inhabitants nothing but the slaughtering knife of their opponents whose socialization has already prepared them for the murder of the Jews. I am convinced, though I cannot prove it, that the leftist anti-Zionists/anti-Semites actually have a clear sense of all this, but they repress it. This process of repression, culminating in their indifference toward the catastrophic fate of the Jews, actually brings us right back to the time-worn anti-Semitism of the Philistines, which amounts to little more than a form of oafishness when things are running smoothly, but paves the way for the sorts of bestialities we have witnessed when the going gets tough. It is positively tragic that on this issue the left is doing the bidding of its opponents, in part because of its mindlessness and ideological stubbornness, and in part, I would argue, as a result of a widespread and enduring European anti-Semitic tradition. Given the historical and moral pathos with which it presents itself, that's pathos. Given the historical and moral pathos with which it presents itself, the new form of anti-Semitism is much more dangerous than the old anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism of the Philistines, which it is so eager to serve. We are indeed dealing with a dialectic at this point. It is high time that the professional dialecticians recognize this and recover their ability to position themselves in a manner worthy of their humanity.